I'm Steve Gaynor. I'm the co-founder of Fulbright. We're an independent game studio in Portland, Oregon. I got into the games industry through being a level designer on the BioShock series. I was a level designer on BioShock 2 and worked on the DLC for that game, and then was a level designer on BioShock Infinite for a year before I decided to come back to Portland and start my own company. And here at Fulbright, our first game was Gone Home, which is sort of the game that I think inspired the term walking simulator to be used as a general genre name. But it's a game about it's a first-person game about exploring a house and trying to find out the story of the people who live there by what you find. And after that game was fortunately very successful for us, we moved on to our second game, which was Tacoma, which is similar genre, but a high-tech story about being on an abandoned space station and learning what happened to the crew by interacting with these augmented reality recordings of events that had happened on board and piecing together that story that way. We're currently working on our third game in partnership with Annapurna Interactive, which we haven't announced anything about yet, but it's well on its way to being ready for us to start talking about before too long.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So I mentioned this before. I mean, I don't know why I go back and forth on it. I guess I am curious, and I guess it's also just like part of what I'm documenting is just sort of like, what is life like for, people whose lives include video games, people who make games. I guess I'm just curious, like as far as day to day, maybe big picture wise, like obviously no one is really having the year we were expecting to. Like, how much has, quarantine and the pandemic and all that, how much has that changed life for you working on games?
For us, it hasn't really had the hugest impact, and if anything, I think there's a certain way that just work-wise, it's had a positive impact. Like there are really positive things about being able to be in the office together, just like a feeling of connection with the people that you're working with and being able to, notice things that people are working on and have organic conversations. But the flip side is working from home. I think there's a little bit more. There can be when you're working with a team that you're not just sort of like offloading on your own a lot, but you're in contact with the other team members through video chat and other things a lot. There's a certain additional structure to it, at least for me, where I feel like I have a little bit more clear boundaries of like, okay, I'm in a video call with people right now. We're talking about this subject. Now the call's over, and I'm focusing on this other thing, and being able to more clearly compartmentalize your attention, I think, is pretty valuable in its own way. And I think that, our company, we were all set up to work from home before the pandemic, at least part-time, and now we're just doing it full-time. And I think that being forced to improve our remote communications and remote working practices will also just benefit us in the longer term when we're not doing it 100% of the time, by making us more effective when we are doing it. Downside has been everybody, I think, has obviously a higher level of just like ambient stress and distraction from world events and from being stuck at home for the reasons that we are. So, that's been something that people have had to, put the time and attention into dealing with and taking seriously. That's been affecting the work in a different way. But it's been a balance. I think that we all feel pretty good about how we're doing in the current circumstances.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't know. I really wouldn't tie this into the previous question if it's had any change. But I was curious. I mean, as you sort of were saying about work you've done in the past, I mean, I'm just curious, like, sort of how you see yourself. I mean, do you see yourself as a writer, as a designer, both, neither, all of the above, and something else?
I definitely see myself as a writer and designer, primarily in the sense that I think that with the kind of games that we make, those two things are inseparable. So like the ways that we create a player experience in our games and that we express a narrative in our games, it's at least as much about the interactive aspect and the traditionally designed side of the game, whether that's level layout and player flow and mechanical design and kind of like UI feedback that tells you how you should think about what you're able to do, and the placement of objects in the world and what it means about what order you see them in when you enter a space. All of that stuff is at least as important to the final outcome of what we make as the actual writing. Like, my perspective is that we don't make a game to give you a way to experience the story that I'm writing. I'm writing a story to give you motivation to play the game that we're making. So I hope that is a good way of looking at it that has a certain level of humility to it, that it doesn't prize the writing itself over everything, but puts it in terms of how effectively it's supporting the game in total. So it's a very kind of holistic outlook that I personally need to have. And on top of that, I have like 3 other jobs that are like running the company and doing PR and like the other stuff. But as far as what goes into the game itself, it's a lot of coordination with team members to kind of guide all of those aspects in a direction that feels like it's pulling together.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that you wear many hats depending on the time of day. There's probably no time you're only wearing a single hat. But to talk through like a writer's lens and, writing story for games, what's your sense of like what character usually is expected to mean in games, and what more depth would you maybe like to see added to that notion?
For me, it all comes from the genre that the game is in, and therefore what the player's role is in the game. I think that generally the most successful versions of character in games is the version where it feels like it is in total support of what you're doing and what actions you have available to yourself and what space the player takes up within the interactive frame. In our games, in Gone Home and Tacoma, and even in Minerva's Den, up until the story reveal at the end, we do situate the player in a space where the player character, who you're actually in the shoes of, has an understandable connection to the space that you're exploring and the fictional premise that the story is based on, but they are mostly anonymous. Like, you understand that you're playing as Katie in Gone Home, and Katie is Sam's sister, and you're kind of like the good, you're the older daughter, you're kind of the goody two-shoes kid. And that's kind of it, and like, okay, I have a reason to be here at this house looking through all this stuff because this is my family and I'm worried about where they are, and I know what part of the family I am. But aside from that, everything I'm discovering is the character of the other people that relate to me through that role. And so, in our games, it's like, I hope and I think that our games are appropriate for that kind of approach to character. But in other games, I think that, like, in the Doom reboot in 2016, the Doom Slayer is a completely appropriate use of character in that game, because it's like you're playing as a dude that blows the shit out of everything. Like, that's it. We don't need to know what his deep backstory is, or really any deep backstory in that game in general. But in a game like Life is Strange, for instance, it's really valuable for you to know deeply who you're playing as, so you can make decisions through her voice and to try to represent her as the character that you are playing in the dialogue and the other decisions that you're making, as well as the characters that you encounter, to know what it means to make those decisions in relation to them. So I guess, the shorter version of that is just, I don't think that there is any kind of universal answer for that. I'm always just looking for the approach to character that fits the game that I'm experiencing. And I think we have a lot of instances as players and critics and whatever else you want to say, where the failure cases are the ones where the approach to characterization feels like it's directly at odds with how I'm playing the game and who I am within the world, and that those things don't fit together. So kind of knowing your context and working towards that, and not kind of taking these assumptions about character that don't fit within that space and trying to bring it to a game that doesn't really have that as its focus. I think that's the most important aspect of thinking about it to me.
Do you have an example that comes to mind? I don't want to ask you to point fingers at anyone else's game, but just an example of cases where maybe there was sort of a failure, where there was things are at odds with the context you're talking about.
Sure. No, I mean, I think when you ask questions like that, you can always reach back to old games and games that are universally beloved. So it's fine if you say something about them that doesn't that isn't totally complimentary. I think that, for instance, I think you could make an argument that the completely voiceless anonymous protagonist in GTA 3 is a much more successful version of characterization of the player character in a GTA game than CJ in GTA San Andreas, because you don't have that sense of the classic term ludonarrative dissonance when you are just this agent of chaos that is a completely empty vessel. And if you just go crazy blowing everybody up in a mission, okay, well, that's what you did. But if we characterize CJ as this guy with a family that you sympathize with, that you want to be able to kind of role play as somebody who wouldn't do GTA stuff, the game really asks you to fight against that characterization as opposed to giving you the tools to lean into it.
Right.
I think that's what the whole ludonarrative dissonance concept comes from, is saying, because Clint Hawking, when he termed that, he was referring to the original BioShock, and it was I want to play this game as a character is being put into the emotional and moral space of, should I exploit these little girls to get this extra resource, or should I save them and sacrifice my own self-interest to support them, and show that I care about them? But then the game balance of the game said, well, if you save them, you get more stuff anyway. So you're no longer engaging with a moral conundrum. You're engaging with numbers that tell you what you should be doing. I think that's the kind of thing where you're sort of I want to express or understand character in this one way that I intuitively connect with on a personal level, and the game either doesn't allow me to do that or encourages me to act against that for reasons that are outside of my own judgment. I think that's when you start to feel that friction, and it kind of pushes you out of the role that you're inhabiting.
Gotcha. Well, to sort of flip it and zoom out a bit, I mean, what feeling do you get out of making games or in expressing yourself in that way?
That's a good question. Have you ever noticed when people say that's a good question, they actually just mean, I don't know?
It sounds like a humble brag if I say yes, because it implies I've heard it a lot. I've come to understand it to mean I need to buy some time here.
Yeah, I'm going to need to think about that for a second.
Which is fine, and I appreciate it. Compliment.
Yeah,
whatever. It's fine.
Yeah. For me, I think that I come from a space of having grown up with games and also television and music and books and movies and all the other stuff that everybody else does. But like for me, I know that just growing up, I had this distinct connection to games that I think, in retrospect, was about the ability to inhabit this imagined space directly and affect it and live within it in a way that you were actively part of it in a way that was unique. Also, I mean, I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and games were doing so much unique technological stuff over that time that I think there was this feeling of excitement of, you know, you go from being a Nintendo kid to an SNES kid or a DOS game kid to having your first 3D accelerator card. You know, you go from Doom to Quake or whatever. And just the breadth of the kinds of experiences that you could have within this whole range of different kinds of games, that I think the central feeling of that, of being able to inhabit all of these different contexts and play all these different roles and be present within all of these different game worlds in this very kind of direct way, I think that central kind of kernel of what the great version of those experiences was just really spoke to me in a way that that other media didn't connect in that same sense. And it felt like there was, I don't know, it felt like you had this kind of special connection, I think, at that time, especially, of kind of being like, games can be my thing. Everybody wants to go see the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie or whatever, but like I can like have this thing where I'm like, if you're discovering these games and what they could be in a way that was really exciting. So, going forward from that, I think it's just like kind of a sense of wanting to contribute to that space and, in a way, give something back, and not give something back, quote unquote, to the medium or to be beholden to, the canon or whatever you want to talk about in the space of like the body of work itself, but more to give something back to other people that I know are growing up or have grown up having that connection to these experiences. And so being able to say, like, I want to make something that throughout my life, whether it's in the present day or when I was growing up, that if I played it, I would feel like I was getting this unique, deep feeling of connection to this very specific kind of crafted moment that we get to share but have our own version of. I think that's what excites me more than anything else about being able to be creative or to be expressive through the form that we work in. Yeah. And I'm not one of those people who got into games because I wanted to write a movie, but so I guess I'll write a game instead. It's like I want to make the game, and the kind of stuff that we make is what both appeals to me the most, and I'm the most capable, I think, of turning into something that's worth having been made in the first place. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this. I mean, it's not asking you to look into a crystal ball, but I'm curious, like, where... Because I don't know. It feels like this question is saying, like, oh, where do you think video games are heading? I think really what I'm wondering is, like, where do you feel like the pendulum is sort of starting to swing now? Although I'm not sure if it is a pendulum, and I'm not sure if it's cyclical. I guess, like, the question is, like, what sort of is stuff you're noticing on the horizon or in the margins of the horizon that, like, is starting to get popular? Maybe you're even slightly skeptical of it, or maybe you can't figure out what it is. Like, is there stuff you're seeing that's out there that seems to be, picking up momentum? And it doesn't have to be like, it could be anything, it could be like a type of subject matter, it could be a type of character, it could be a type of creator. Is there anything like that sort of jumps to mind?
I'm not sure. I'm personally, with the with where the technology is now and where it, like, the next steps forward towards where the technology can get to next, I'm pretty skeptical of VR. Personally, I played Half-Life Alyx, and it was one of the only VR games that I've put like a meaningful amount of time into, and I thought it was a really unique, excellent experience that I really enjoyed a lot, and I'm glad that I played it, but I didn't enjoy the way that I had to play it, which was with 5 pounds of computer hardware on my head. And it's just so awkward. Like, so if there's something that I kind of like raise an eyebrow at, for me, it's mostly VR, where I'm just sort of like, we tried it in the 90s, now we're trying it again. I think we're going to try it in another 20 years, and then I'll be I'll be excited about the accessibility of it and what it can do that other types of games can't do, but also that you can just sort of like fluidly interact with it and not have all this baggage that comes along with it. So I guess I would say I don't see VR really blowing up in the next 5 or even 10 years, personally. Maybe I'm wrong. That would be my guess. The flip side of it is I think that, there's a lot of... I think that we are continuing down a path more broadly of there being more opportunities for more creators to explore more aspects of what games both haven't done yet and have done in the past, but have kind of been left, as a relic and haven't been picked back up for a while. And for people to be able to create things that speak to this kind of breadth of what we can do or what we have done and want to re-examine, and create them and distribute them in ways that, 20 years ago we didn't really have access to. And that's something that, I felt was the case since we were first working on Gone Home, when it was like anybody can make a game and put it on Steam, or you can make a Kickstarter, and if you just have an excited audience, you can get your game funded. You can make a game jam game and somebody can just download it and play it for free, or you can put something in a browser. You don't have to go through the traditional channels of having getting into retail or being on PlayStation or Xbox or whatever to get your game in front of audiences. And of course that's always been true because people have been making small games and independent games in different ways since the advent of games. I mean, the first games like like Space War and stuff obviously were were made on like mainframes by college students and stuff like that. But like going forward, as we went into the 2010s, there was so much more of a pickup of smaller groups being able to develop stuff and put it straight onto Xbox through Xbox Live Arcade, and then the explosion of games coming onto Steam and independent games coming onto all the platforms directly without needing a traditional publisher, and itch.io, and we're at this point where we're seeing all of these lines cross, where I think that before, a game that may have just never gotten made or been a really obscure game that would be hard to even find can now break through in a way that people never would have imagined would be possible. I think we can look at examples like something like Undertale is, like a low-fi pixel art kind of re-examination of Earthbound, and it's a massive hit, but 10 years earlier, who was going to say that basically an SNES game, but made not in the 90s with this sort of meta commentary about what these games mean, would be an enormous financial hit. I think going forward, I feel fortunate to be part of the other end of that spectrum where we're able to work with Annapurna, and Annapurna is a much bigger, more traditional publisher with a lot of funding, and they're able to take these, interesting games and creators with specific voices and give them a platform to be able to work at a scale and to achieve an audience that probably in many cases would have been effectively impossible until a publisher that had the outlook to support this kind of stuff came on the scene and said, we're going to take these games that we believe in and that people connect with on this really personal level, and we're going to treat them like projects that, can support a larger budget and that can find an audience if we bring it to them. I think we're just continuing on that trajectory where we're discovering how many different things, not just the stuff we've played 100 times before, really can have an audience if we just give it a chance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you sort of touched on something I was thinking of asking you about anyway, and I guess Undertale sort of gets at that, which I was just going to ask, are there things from the past that you'd like to see games sort of scoop up or revisit or re-examine? I'm not saying it's a thing that you have to do. I'm not saying you think someone else specifically should have to
Sure.
do. But I guess I'm curious, is there stuff that maybe you're still wondering about, and are there reasons other than nostalgia to re-examine them?
I don't know. I think that one example that was very recent, or within the last year or two, the game 2 Point Hospital came out, and it's really just a remake of Theme Hospital. But that's one of those things where it was clearly some people were like, Theme Hospital was cool. Nobody's made one since 1996. Well, if we just made a Theme Hospital, that'd be tight. It's yeah, it would be. And a bunch of people who didn't play the original now get to play it. And to some degree, for me, I feel like that's almost enough of an excuse where it's okay, well, you could just say, put the original Theme Hospital on GOG.com and tell people to download it. But we've learned a ton about making experiences accessible without reducing the impact that they have, and just modern quality of life software stuff in the intervening time. And so if there's this thing that was that was awesome, nobody's playing it, let's just make it again but better, and then everybody can have that experience again. I personally see that as a totally valid motivation to kind of revive something forgotten like that. I think there's space for something like that.
Well, yeah.
And also the flip side of let's kind of do the new self-aware version of going back to this thing and thinking about what it means now, and those things can live side by side.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, more pragmatically, sometimes those things fall away and you literally cannot play them anymore on a modern machine.
Totally.
So
yeah,
it's I guess just from a strict hey, you can buy a thing like this now. That's a good reason. It can exist now. So yeah, so you're obviously you're a game developer. Game developers, and for a time you had a podcast where you talked to other game developers, and I guess I'm just curious, what are things that, because I'm not a game developer, what are things that game developers sort of discuss with each other that is kind of never really touched on by fans or media sites or social media? What are kind of a few things that are important to game developers that it seems like the rest of the world doesn't realize is important to you?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because on my podcast, Tone Control, which you can still find on the Idle Thumbs network, it was an opportunity to talk to developers about their experience in their own careers and how they got in and creating games. And my hope was that it would give us a space to kind of talk about stuff that actually, the funny thing is, it was actually a space for me to be able to talk to other game developers about stuff the game developers don't talk to each other about. Because when you sit down at a conference with a developer that you really respect, you don't say so tell me what it was like, when you were working on that game that I was a big fan of, and what do you remember from that time, and what kind of design lessons did you take from that you carry with you? So weirdly enough, that interview podcast was an excuse to basically like go into topics that we don't normally talk about. But the flip side is, because it was something that we were recording on mic for an audience, I generally, we were all pretty open with each other, but there was a certain level of knowing that we're talking to the public at the time.
Right.
So we still, therefore, didn't talk about the stuff that maybe you would, because a lot of the stuff that you're going to talk about when nobody's listening is just like complaining.
Right.
being like, this project's really hard, like the suits said we had to do this thing, or like, we don't want to crunch, but we don't know any other way to get it done but to do it, and we're having budget problems, and this thing was all fucked up, and like whatever. So I think that game developers, they're just like the rest of us. We sit down and we're sort of like, I'm going to complain about my job. But I think that's the part that you don't talk about publicly, because like if you're talking on mic and you're in kind of an interview situation and you talk about how hard it is and the stuff that's really challenging and the stuff that is really frustrating, I think it does just sound like you're kind of being a little bit of a whiner, or you're like, throwing other people under the bus. Because at the end of the day, it's like you want to talk about what's going to be cool about your game, or what is, or like what it means to you, or other stuff that you're playing, or whatever. So I think that game developers getting together and having that shared perspective on what it actually takes to get the thing done, and to feel like they have the safe space to kind of open up about what's not easy about it, is maybe the biggest thing you'd hear if you were just a fly on the wall at GDC behind closed doors or whatever.
Well, were you mainly talking to people who like you had talked to before, or was there also an element of like this, it's a good, sort of like this thing here.
Yeah.
It's like, well, this is an excuse to talk to someone you don't really know, but would maybe like to.
No, yeah, most of the people that I talked to on Tone Control, either, I only knew them online beforehand, or we had hung out a few times at a conference. There's only a couple of people that I had worked with or were personal friends for a long time. Even people that I kind of came up with in the industry, but we never were like super close. But there were also people who I literally met. Hey, are you back?
Yeah, I heard a click and then you were gone. Last thing I heard was you said literally people who, and then ... Yeah.
I'll pick it back up.
Thank you.
But a lot of the interviews were people who literally, I met them for the first time, 15 minutes before we got on the mic. And in general, I didn't do a ton of research. I only really wanted to know as much as I would already know as someone who kind of pays attention to the industry and knows people in it, so that the conversations could be genuinely about what I did want to find out about them, and kind of discovering what we would talk about. But there's certainly a mix part of that one.
Well, I probably shouldn't preface questions like this. I hate questions like this, and people ask me this all the time about these interviews, but like, so I know you did seasons of your podcast a few years apart. Do you remember like what you had learned doing them, then pausing, then going back to doing them again? Like, or do you even think about it that way? Like stuff you learned because of it, was that even necessarily a reason why you were doing it, was to learn stuff? Hello?
Hello?
Third time's the charm. What's up? Um, yeah, I don't know how much of that you heard. I basically was just asking. You did your podcast seasons like a few years apart, and I was just asking, like,
Yeah.
well, what did you learn doing them, pausing, and then doing them again, and then just sort of asking, like, well, or was that even what you were setting out to do, to learn anything?
For me, it was mostly we had ships gone home, and I knew I was going to be going to a lot of conferences and being in the same place at the same time as other game developers. So I took the excuse to just do, my kind of 6-month spread of grabbing people as we'd be in the same place and getting to talk to them. And then we started up development on Tacoma, and I was really focused on that. And then after we shipped that, it was kind of another opportunity to say, let's pull people in and do another round of this. I might do it again after this project. I think it just kind of depends on if I feel like I have the energy and attention for it, and that there would really be value in it compared to the first two that I did. I also have a little daughter now, so I might be doing less traveling in general than I did the last couple times around. It was just sort of the right time and place to do it as a quote unquote season, and knock them out as a little bit of an event, and then come back to it the next time I had the chance.
Well, so I mean, I don't know how long ago Gone Home feels to you. That was about 7 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I guess I'm curious, like, how you sort of track, like, how the whole sort of nebulous ecosystem of, like, independent developers, or sort of the way there are, like, online personas among developers and such. Like, how do you feel like the whole character of sort of the ecosystem and the way people conduct themselves has, like, changed since 7 years ago?
Well, right now, I am pretty logged off as far as keeping up with it goes. I don't think it's a coincidence that around the time my daughter was born, I just kind of realized I didn't care about checking social media anymore. And I don't think it's a complete one-to-one thing. And it's certainly not something where I'm like, oh, I didn't have time anymore. It's just sort of, maybe it was some unconscious version of my perspective changing a little bit as far as priorities go, or maybe I also think that since 2012, 2013, Twitter especially has legitimately become, weaponized in a really negative way that I just don't want to, Twitter in 2009 to 2012 was very different than, present day, right? And so I think legitimately I'm like, this is not an experience that I want to have anymore. But yeah, so I'm a little bit more at arm's length. I mean, I guess that's part of it. I'm just sort of less involved in it. So my perspective on it has changed for that reason. But I think that it's anything where generationally, basically, we have these kinds of waves, and I feel like I was in a wave that included the guys from Supergiant and, Davey Reedon and Lucas Pope and, a number of people who were releasing the games that kind of got attention in the sort of 2010 to 2013, 14 kind of time zone. And I think that at this point, I'm into all sorts of games that come out and that I hear about being interesting, exciting, and that I want to play. And I'm just a little bit less aware of the scene that they come out of,
Right. After logging out of it, becoming less involved in it, which is also a place I'm in and have been for a while. I mean, how do you feel like that affected your relationship with any of it? I mean, or do you feel like it changed your overall sanity levels, or do you still hear? Because I still hear very often from other people who seem to be constantly miserable about it, but won't leave it.
Yeah. No, I mean, generally speaking, I think I've made the choice that's right for me. Like I had an Instagram account for a while that I didn't really publicize or anything, but I followed friends and industry people and stuff, and just at some point, I just kind of had that realization of just like, I don't think I'm getting anything out of refreshing this website anymore, so I just deleted my account. I'm not deleting my Twitter account because I have too many followers and it's too useful to be able to put promotional stuff on there, but like, I would love to have the excuse just to completely disengage. That said, that I still keep up with people in the industry and people I've worked with, but it's in a more direct way. We really email each other to see how we're doing and talk about stuff, or on mailing lists and stuff like that. So I think that I still have access to the cool, interesting stuff that's going on via the word of mouth factor from all the people that I know I'm in contact with, but I don't have to be swimming in it anymore, day in and day out.
I mean, I think this is kind of a weird question, but like I was talking to somebody else who has also left it behind, and well, at least just the social media access to it. Yeah, we were talking about like his feeling is like sort of, I don't know, post around the time we're talking about after gone home, but not relating to it. He's just had this feeling that like the whole like notion of like cult of personality around independent developers is sort of died out, and I think it's sort of a weird question because it's like, well, how do you measure it, and is that even the right thing to say? Like, is that even the right label to apply to it? Like, is it a cult of personality? I don't know if the sort of thing you're talking about. I'm not sure if I know the sort of thing I'm talking about, but like, have you sensed like, has there been a lessening of that being a thing on social media among, in that sort of that small portion of the ecosystem, or are you too far away from it now to be able to say one way or the other?
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of not sure. I just don't keep up with that aspect of it that much. Yeah. I think that I'm always interested to see who has a presence, like at GDC, and I'm like, oh, this person is speaking about this game that they worked on, and to maybe see people that are being able to kind of speak about and represent their work in that kind of like face of the game or face of the company kind of way. But I was in that space for a while, where I felt like I was very visible and I was doing a lot of press and stuff like that. And I think it's one of those things that's only fun for so long, until you've kind of gone through the whole loop, and then you're sort of like, all right, well, this is actually kind of a lot of work too. And so, that's part of, for me, the draw of working with a publisher on this game is like, I can be like, all right, so like promoting this thing and making sure people buy it and like, putting the face of it out in the world is like kind of somebody else's problem. That sounds pretty good to me at this point. Though I'm still, so I just, it's like, I want to be able to do the interviews that I want to do and not do them just because I have to. Do you know what I mean? And,
yes, as someone who also is on the other side of this table, yes, I can relate.
So it's fun to be able to go out there into the world and kind of like speak for your game while also allowing it to speak for itself. But I don't want it to feel like something that the game lives or dies on being signed up for maintaining that kind of presence year after year.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we're coming up on time soon, and I don't think there's really any good segue into this, but something I wanted to get to was, in our emails, you were sort of expressing some skepticism over games as, I have this here in quotes, personal improvement. And I guess I was wondering, like, what were you talking about there? Were you talking specifically about like gamification, or like what context, I guess, should we get into here before we understand, like, is skepticism overstating it, or?
I don't think so. I mean, you gave me a specific question prompt. Do you have that available?
Oh gosh. I think it probably would have been a response to.
I think it was something like.
It's like what do people who champion games maybe have wrong about games?
Oh yeah, I think it was something like that. Yeah,
the only one that would make sense to as a response.
Yeah. There's this. I think that we see games as often being a diminished art form or form of entertainment versus some other endeavors that have more cultural cachet, and I think that there can be a tendency sometimes to want to justify their value by pointing out what other functional purpose they can serve. So saying, surgeons that play video games score 50% higher on their precision of doing their surgery tests or something like that. Saying like, well, video games are worth existing because they help doctors with their hand-eye coordination, or using games as a motivator to do other things. So it's like, well, but we made this game that encourages you to volunteer to help hungry people, and it's like the game is justified by the real world result that it has. The game in and of itself isn't the valuable thing, but the effect that it has justifies its existence. Other versions like that of saying like playing a game makes you or the world better in a way that's outside of the game, and therefore that's why games are good, or that's why we should care about them. And for me, it's just like, sure, you can read novels and you can be like, reading these novels improved my vocabulary. It gave me knowledge about these different, like historical events that I wasn't aware of before, and made me just a more erudite person. But I think the value of reading novels is that you have the experience of reading it and having read it and having that fictional experience be a part of your life experience. And that's what I think the real value of games that are made for entertainment. Obviously there are serious games that are specifically like for training people or for some kind of functional form, but for games that are first and foremost for the sake of the game itself, I think that putting real value into just the creation for its own sake and not trying to make excuses for it is the, I think it's the way of thinking about it that respects what we make and why we play them more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about it as, we see it as like a diminished thing, and I think it may go deeper than that, where it's like a thing that, I don't know, it's like many of us who are into it, we're still embarrassed by them in some way. I don't know why that continues to be a thing, but I'm always surprised at like the ways it manifests and sort of how deeply it goes. But maybe that's another thing that you feel like maybe you've kind of drifted away from seeing as much.
I don't know. I mean, I think that part of what makes that challenging for games is that you can have an experience with a game that can be really deep or meaningful, not in a like Pulitzer Prize winning change your life like traditional sense of that, but like that you feel a deep connection to and that you get a lot of value out of and that means something to you through the act of being in it and being a part of it that isn't visible from the outside. So, if I'm watching a movie that moves me deeply emotionally, probably someone looking over my shoulder can just be like, oh, I see, this is like a meaningful work of art. And if I watch a Marvel movie and it brings me to tears, probably someone looking over my shoulder is like, well, that's silly, right? And I think that most games are that. You know, like they don't, if you aren't part of it, and you don't share that experience of knowing, like, yeah, this looks silly from the outside, but because of how my experience of it is when I'm engaging with it, it means all this stuff that you can't see. I think that can kind of, you can get defensive about it. You can be like, yeah, but you don't understand. It's like, it's not just about these little green guys trying to land a spaceship on a moon. It's like, I figured out how to bend physics to my will, and I accomplished something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's so hard to express in a way that, if you aren't already bought in, isn't easy to dismiss. I think that makes it a difficult space to inhabit if you're not totally at ease with with just being like, yeah, you think that I'm doing something that's kind of dumb, but I know it's not, and that's fine. But it's tough,
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I know. So this will be my last one for you, and I think it's actually kind of related to that. What do you feel video games have accomplished?
I think that video games have accomplished creating an explosion of unique and distinctive experiences that is broader and more varied in form and content than any other human medium of creation in history. Obviously, words are the ultimate building block, and any two novels can be as different from each other as from any other thing in the world. But like, the experience, like the medium of games, is both what they contain and fundamentally what they are. And that's something that arises from their digital nature and from the fact that there's no physical bounds on what they could be. But there's nothing creatively that we've done that contains more in a fundamental sense than everything that people have created as video games since their inception.
You can't see, but I'm nodding. Just letting it letting it land. All right.
And it's not a value judgment. I will never say that therefore games are better than X. But in a fundamental way, they embody endless possibility, and even with what they already contain, they haven't even started to fulfill all the possibility that they point to, and that's just incredibly thrilling.